Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this video. And in this video, I will be interviewing Mr. Bender, who is doing a very interesting job out of my perspective, who is a conference interpreter for German, Chinese, and English. And today I will ask him a few questions regarding this work. And Mr. Brender, maybe you can first of all introduce yourself a little bit.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me. My name is Felix Brender. I'm a conference interpreter for English, Chinese, and German. We could talk a little bit about where we as conference interpreters get to work. I also teach on the Masters in Conference Interpreting at the University of Heidelberg, and wearing a second hat, as it were, I'm also a PhD student, and I teach and study at the London School of Economics, and my PhD work revolves around Chinese security policy, and I specifically look at the case of Chinese security efforts in the context of South Sudan. So that's essentially me.
Okay, wow, interesting, very interesting indeed. But may I ask, like, China's security policy and conference interpreting, it's quite something different, right?
No, I think there's actually quite a few overlaps. So not least because a lot of my conference interpreting work actually touches on security matters, right? I mean, security is quite a wide field, and I mean, there's the high politics aspect of it, right? So at the diplomatic level, at the ministerial level, also of course at the leaders level, as it were. So there's certainly that aspect. A lot of my work now revolves around data security, privacy, copyright, that sort of stuff. And all of that actually feeds into the security field, right? So there's actually quite a few overlaps. And if anything, that has been quite annoying because, of course, I can't cite anything that I learn about in closed door meetings. And very often I kind of feel like, I could write this in one of my papers, but I can't because it's, this is not public knowledge. So there's actually a surprising amount of overlap.
Okay, I see. Then maybe the first question regarding conference interpreting. How did you decide to become a conference interpreter?
Oh, how did I decide? So that's a very good question. It's a very difficult question to answer. I did an internship when I was still in sixth form. And at the time, for some reason, I mean, there's a lot of kind of random events that led to this. I got to know the former interpreter for Erich Honecker, the East German leader, who ended up doing something entirely different after the end of the Cold War. And I found her as a person just absolutely fascinating. And my only reason, I think, for wanting to be an interpreter for a very, very long time was that person. I just found it incredibly cool. Beyond that, then, there was also a film called I would say The Whisperers. It's called The Whisperers, which was, I think, a film that came out in 2005. And in 2005, that film really inspired me. It's about interpreters. And I think it's still the only documentary about interpreters. And I felt that's a really cool life that these people lead. And I want to be that person. I actually did something entirely different. So I did area studies, anthropology, Southeast Asian studies for my bachelor's, and for my first master's. And it was only then that I decided, okay, now I have to make a bit of money. So I trained on top of all of this as an interpreter. So I kind of put that plan on hold for a couple of years, and then I kind of came back and circled back to interpreting. Yeah, I haven't progressed since.
Yeah, it sounds very interesting, and I can also feel like that I personally also would like to do this, but my skills, Chinese skills, are still far away from this level. And I'm also happy with what I'm doing. But now, maybe, how does a normal working day for you look like as a conference interpreter?
Yeah, so that's another really good question. We don't really have a regular working day.
Okay.
If anything, what I would do kind of as a ritual in the morning is to listen to the news in all of my 3 working languages. So just to kind of understand what's on the agenda for these spaces on that particular day. And in many ways, I mean, the things that people talk about in the UK, the US, in Germany, and then in China are going to be quite different every single day. So the agenda is a bit different. And it's just important to know about these things. So just activate the languages kind of early on in the day. What we kind of do mostly as freelancers, I mean, there's no kind of regular kind of structure to our days. Of course, the obvious aspect that everybody sees is the actual interpreting. So we showing up at at a conference, right, and doing our job. But a lot of it actually goes into it before that. So we spend most of our time actually preparing for assignments. So that's reading into the people that we'll be working for. What if they said in kind of political context, do they have any positions that they've been supporting for quite a while? How do they feel about the respective other as well, right? So how do, say like we're doing a state visit to China, and there's quite a large delegation, and I'm there to for one of the members of the delegation, it's useful for me to find out how they feel about China, how they feel about the government, how they feel about, the economy and those sort of things. And this happens in kind of all contexts. For more scientific conferences, we would probably look more into, what is that field about? So to the extent possible, right? So what are the kind of most recent discussions in, I don't know, charging infrastructure for e-cars? Right, that sort of stuff. So we're kind of just trying to read our way into the field and to really understand what's happening more than just learn the words, right? Because interpreting is about much more than just knowing words.
Yeah, you already mentioned like for some requests, for instance, like the scientific conferences, like who is usually requesting to have you as an interpreter?
Yeah, so I mean that's also one of the great benefits of this job, this profession, the fact that actually there is no kind of one single client. So there is the kind of the public sector, so the governmental kind of institutional sector, which is about some international institutions, the EU, the UN, governments, of course, as well, hiring a lot of interpreters. They do have quite a few people in-house, but very often for kind of larger conferences and the like, they will not have people on site who can cover all of the interpretation for that particular end. And then a lot of us work on the private market, and that's particularly fascinating. So starting with SMEs, so smaller businesses, all the way up to really large for science-based. So there's the business aspect of things, business negotiations, board meetings, that sort of stuff, and then the scientific conferences, which are also absolutely fascinating.
Okay. And for you personally, what is the most? Who's like mostly coming to you? Is it companies or government or from the scientific?
I like all of my clients, so that I think they all have their kind of very specific challenges. First, I do quite like smaller scale negotiations. So I do like kind of small settings, simply because you feel like you're much more intimately involved in what's going on. So those are quite a lot of fun, I would say. But then so are kind of very large conferences. They all kind of have their appeals and benefits and disadvantages as well. Yeah.
Okay. And now maybe as you have experienced many different conferences, is there maybe sometimes some weird moments or also funny moments which you experienced there, or which from an outsider point of view could be interesting to know?
Yeah, so I mean, of course, I can't talk about this in the context of of what my audiences do or don't do at those conferences. So whatever happens at a conference is going to stay there. So I can't talk about these things. That said, what does happen quite a lot as an interpreter is that you realize that mistakes happen. For me, they happen. And you sort of have to build a very thick skin earlier or later, and also develop skills to probably make sure that your audience doesn't realize every single time you make a mistake. So I could probably tell you kind of funnier stories and mistakes that just happen. So for instance, in English, we talk about a person who has one single skill and is quite probably a skill that lots of people find fascinating, and we would refer to that person, but doesn't know anything else. We would refer to that person as a one-trick pony. And there was a conference, I was working from Chinese into English, and the concept that the speaker was describing was exactly that. So somebody who has one skill that is probably quite surprising to most people, but also doesn't know anything else beyond that one single skill. So I was sort of myself to say in that situation to be able to think of one trick pony, but for some reason it came out as one horse pony. And I don't quite know why this happened. Maybe because I was thinking about like, horse pony, I don't know. But anyway, for some reason I said one horse pony instead of one trick pony. And it never rains, but it pours. So the whole concept came up like, 2 or 3 more times. And every single time I kept saying one horse pony because I didn't even realize I was saying it. And my booth buddy, so we usually work in teams of 2 or 3. So the person sitting next to me totally realized. And she had, so she kind of tried to tell me that, like, I kept saying one horse pony instead of one trick pony. And I just didn't realize. So it was afterwards, when the mics were off, we talked about this, and it was incredibly embarrassing. But apparently nobody in the audience realized it, because I'd said it with so much confidence, and I was apparently so convincing that it must be a one horse pony rather than a one trick pony, that nobody really noticed. So that's part of that. It's also interesting, the kind of the second story maybe in that context, like, embarrassing stories about my working life, is that lots of people believe, lots of outsiders believe that, it's very, the difficult aspect of interpreting is the specialized and specialist vocab. So, all the terminology that you have to, get under your belt. And that's really what makes interpreting challenging. And actually, from an interpreter's perspective, of course, I can only talk for myself. I can only speak for myself here. But the challenging aspect of interpreting isn't necessarily the terminology, simply because you prepare it, you walk in with probably with a list of words, etc. So the words that you're most likely not to be able to think of are the really easy ones. So this is a few years back as well. I was at a conference on e-driving. So e-cars and the whole shebang, everything about it. So charging stations, and the whole conference was actually quite challenging. Quite a lot of mathematic modeling on where to put charging stations, how many charging stations do you need, how can you upgrade it, how can you set it up in a way that you can easily land it, etc., etc., etc. And sort of halfway through the conference, for some reason, I couldn't for the life of me think of the word car. So this is a conference entirely on e-mobility and e-cars. It's literally there in the title. And for some reason, the one word I couldn't think of was the word car. So I tried to find workarounds to describe what a car is. Right? So this vehicle, so this is a great way of, getting about. So people, who will use their own vehicles to drive. Just because I couldn't think of the word car. And my booth buddy at the time found it quite amusing, because he felt that I was just kind of, I don't know, in a way kind of showing off, like my vocab. And I wasn't. I just quite frankly couldn't think of the word car. So those things sort of happen. Again, my audience didn't notice it, and that's really the key. So to be able to kind of, deal with the situations that could be quite embarrassing for you. There's no harm in them, right? They're just, other than being embarrassing to us as interpreters.
I understand, yeah. And maybe now, because we have COVID, and we know we cannot travel to China especially, and also the opposite way is quite difficult. And so now I guess many conferences will be held online via Zoom maybe, or via Tencent, Woo, or anything else, Teams. What is like the pros and the cons of going through this interpreting and an online conference via an offline conference in person?
Yeah, so from the interpreter's perspective, I like online conferences and interpreting online because I don't have to travel, and I dislike online conferences because I don't get to travel. Okay. So from an interpreting perspective, it's of course always easier and nicer to be nicer. It's more conducive to the process, maybe, to be in the room. So it's always easier to be somewhere on site. So even for settings where, say you have bilateral conferences, bilateral meetings with somewhere in the West with somebody in China. So very often there's still going to be an on-site. So maybe there's a German delegation that meets in Berlin, and you'll be in Berlin too, and then they kind of zoom in the Chinese delegation. So there still is kind of an on-site, right? Beyond. Even though not everybody's on site, so you have some people kind of joining in, but the way that we work as interpreters is still going to be very similar to what we do on site. I can also see how there's other factors that play into it, right? I mean, environmental factors, for instance, right? Just health factors. I mean, there's more to this question of us being in the room or not, than how I feel about it, kind of on a personal level. So I can certainly feel that for some settings, you might actually feel that, you know, working online is probably the better option. So for very short meetings, for instance, you know, do I really need to, you know, travel for 3 or 4 or 5 hours to then interpret for half an hour somewhere and then to kind of do the same thing, you know, and travel back home or to my next assignment? So that's certainly questionable. In that sort of setting, it might be a better idea to actually work online. There are a lot of setups that we have, you know, available to us. So we have interpreting hubs where we can sit in booths, and we have all of the equipment there. There are also kind of interpreting suites or interpreting studios where you've got professional equipment as well. I mean, ultimately, that's what really matters is, you know, the question. I mean, to me, it's not an ideological question of whether or not, you know, you work online or you work on site. I think the question is, you know, can I be sure to offer, you know, very good interpretation in that setup, right? So that's really what matters. And in some settings, you know, doing things online just might not be the best option.
I see. Okay.
Busy.
Yeah,
working,
I see.
So.
And then now to my last question. I could actually raise many more questions, but the last question would be, now we are facing like more and more digitalization and AI and also translation software. And also when I was talking to fellow friends of mine, asking, telling them that I'm learning Chinese, and maybe I can sometimes become use this language for my job as well. And then people were saying, actually, yeah, you won't need it anymore in the future because there will be so much, like Google Translate has also this feature where you can speak, have like this audio translation, but I find it's not good. Now it's like often quite painstaking to use such things. What's your stance about?
This is yeah. So I mean, of course, I don't have a crystal ball, so you know, your guess is probably as good as mine. I would kind of maybe, you know, differentiate between learning a language, which I think is always a good idea. So regardless of whether or not you have to do, I mean, arguably you don't have to do it. I mean, arguably you could just get away with, you know, knowing a bit of English, and that's okay. But I mean, learning a new language is always beneficial beyond kind of the utilitarian context of, you know, I can use it for my job. So you know, it does give you access to another culture. It does give you access to a different way of thinking. So there are lots of benefits to it that, you know, are not immediately linked to, you know, it then kind of culminating in a job, right? And very often, you know, you might even find yourself in a setup where, like, you know, you can use some of your language skills just for a little chit chat, but the relationship that you can develop with somebody that you're talking to in their native language, perhaps, right, is going to be quite different, even though when it gets down to the nitty-gritty, you actually don't use that language because your skills are not quite there yet, or you work with an interpreter, which is always a good idea, of course. So there's that, and then there is translation and interpreting. So translation, of course, is written, so arguably that's easier. It's easier to actually automate that, simply because there's a standard to it. I mean, unless you've got spelling mistakes and the like. When for interpreting, of course, you have this added layer of language recognition, language output. So that might make it a bit trickier. Again, I'm not an expert on this sort of stuff. What I quite like sometimes when I get confronted, because that's one of the first questions I usually get, you know, at dinner table conversations and parties and all that. So, you know, why would you bother do this? Because after all, like, you know, you're going to be phased out anyway. And I like the implication in that question, right? Because very often I feel it tells me more about the person asking the question than me, or, like, you know, the prospects of my job. Because the assumption is always like, you know, you're going to be phased out, but I'm not. And I think on the list of jobs and processes that you can easily automatize, interpreting is actually probably quite, like, low on the list, simply because, you know, it's actually quite complex, and there are a lot of other jobs that you can phase out much earlier. Then again, I do believe that certainly in my lifetime we would be able to automatize interpreting and translating, most likely. I mean, I don't see a reason why not. We are not going to be among the first jobs for that to happen, but also just the fact that we can do it doesn't mean that we necessarily will. So in lots of contexts, the interpreter actually plays a role far beyond, being a translation machine. I mean, a good interpreter, to begin with, does much more than translate or interpret. So, I mean, interpret, it has, in English, certainly has a double meaning, right? So there's a way you interpret as in you transfer, the content of from one language to another. So there's this linguistic transfer. But at the same time, there also is, this aspect to it, to think about what's going on, to interpret, right? To understand, to process, that sort of stuff. And that aspect, I think, is difficult to automatize. So how can you, present somebody else's point of view in a way that is accessible to the other? So one of the risks that we run quite frequently working with Chinese is to over-orientalize, right? So we might, over-interpret or read too much into say, for example, Chengyu, right? So this four-letter sayings, right? And that we kind of over-interpret in the sense that, this is very special. There's a story behind this, and yes, and yes, and yes, and all of that is true. But also in that immediate moment, most Chinese speakers using a Chengyu would not have that story in mind. In the same way that, we probably, know what Carrie calls to Newcastle means, right? But are we actually aware of Newcastle in that specific setting? Probably not, right? I mean, I also kind of, a good example of this also is to call a spade, which just I think 2 or 3 years ago raised quite a bit of a discussion on whether or not to use it, because words in that context have a racist and imperial connotation to it, and is linked to the slave trade. And I'm pretty sure that most people using that expression have no idea of that background, certainly back in when the discussion started, I think, as well. So, and I think the same is true for Chinese. So there's a risk of over-interpreting, right, and kind of over-orientalizing what is being said. And I, as a good interpreter, is actually my job to make what this person says accessible, right? So it's precisely not to kind of kind of indulge too much in oh, this is all so different, so different, so different. My job is actually to make it accessible to you, so to make it, not to make it similar, but to present that information in a way that my listener understands, right? And that, I think, is difficult for a machine to do. So the kind of aspect around it.
Yeah, good example with the Chengyu. I agree on this, and I think Chengyu actually, if you know the Chengyu, if you're familiar with them, it's quite straightforward, to the point. Right, perfect. Yeah, I think now I know a lot about interpreting, and it was very interesting to talk to you. And I would like to ask more questions, but I think the video is long enough already. And thank you a lot for having you here today.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for your time.